Hey guys, and welcome to another tutorial for freshly squeezed samples. This is your host John Gran, and today we're going to be going over part 2 of our mastering series. So in the last video we had basically a very simple layout of how to get our tracks ready for mastering. And so we looked at a lot of things like, what are the certain dBs that you need to be at in order for your mastering engineer to have a lot to work with. In today's part 2, we're going to be looking at a couple of other things that are similar to that, but we'll also get into some of the nitty-gritty of mastering. So the first thing we want to go over is looking at peaks. Now, why are peaks important? Well, because a lot of times when you have a track that has a dynamic range that is not consistent, it can cause some issues. So let's look at what that exactly entails. But in this track right here, as you can see, this track has a few peaks that are at the 3-minute and 56-second mark. There's also another peak over here that's quite high, and as you can tell here, the dynamic range of this overall track is quite good except for those one sections. And if you're wondering what the dynamic range is, it's essentially the difference between the lowest point of your track in terms of the peak intensity, the volume, all the way to the highest, right? And generally speaking, we want to try to deliver tracks that are sort of that don't have such a large dynamic range within your entire song, right? At least for electronic music. If you're doing styles like rock and other things like that where there's a lot of dynamic range, that's totally acceptable. But typically for electronic music, we want our dynamic range to be not too ginormous, right? So in other words, from the beginning of your track to the end of your track, if you're having a loud kick and basses and synths and all these other elements, you kind of want that to be fairly similar throughout the whole track. Now obviously you don't want the intro of your track to be as loud as your drop or as your chorus, or so what you want to do in that case is to have your dynamic range be consistent whenever there is a large number of tracks within that specific region. So with that said, what are some ways that we can fix this problem right here? Well, the first thing I would do is I would go back into the session and actually check out and see what is causing this little bit of peak. So let's go ahead and play it back. It's going to be loud because we're going to be mastering, so I'm not going to turn the volume down, but you can at least hear the track pretty well. So right there, it sounds to me like what's causing this buildup and in other words, creating this peak is actually probably that bass that's going da-na-na. And so what I would do, and which we're not going to do in this video, but what I would do is I would go back into the session, try to figure out how to tame that bass by either using a compressor or some other instrument, and sometimes even an automation tool, just to kind of bring that down a little bit. And the reason why it's probably doing that is because there's a lot of instruments that are playing at the same time, and sometimes when a kick and a bass hit at the same point, it'll sometimes create those peaks like that. Same thing with this one over here. We'll probably hear the same thing. So yeah, the reason why we want to deliver tracks without these ginormous peaks is so that the mastering engineer at the end of the day has a lot more to work with, right? So they'll be able to go in and just be able to master your track and really have a lot of headroom. So that's one thing I would do for sure before we were to master this track. But since we already have it here, let's go ahead and get into the next section that I would do. So what I always like to do whenever I'm starting a mastering chain is I like to always have a gain knob. Now in Ableton, this is just called the utility knob. Every DAW has a different one, but it's great to have these set up here. And I like to set up two. I like to set up one for the very beginning of my chain, and then one that's going to be right before the limiter. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to load in a EQ, and this EQ, what it's going to do is it's going to be the one that I like to use to analyze sort of what's happening in the track. So let's just go ahead and play the track a little bit and just kind of see if we can get any specific idea of maybe what's too loud or what's maybe too low in the track. So let's just go ahead and play it from the breakdown up until we get to the drop. to skip ahead a little bit. Okay, so I've been able to place my mouse underneath this half of Pro Q3, and what it does is it actually kind of slows everything down and creates a little curve that you can see. And the first thing that a mastering engineer might want to do is get rid of this part of the low end, just because that part is typically not perceivable to the human ear. And so a mastering engineer might say, okay, well, let's get rid of this section right here and cut that a little bit with a nice high pass filter. On the high end over here, I noticed that looks like the information is pretty good, but it is kind of low. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, if you're not lacking highs, there's no point in adding more to your track. The mid-range looks pretty good. And then we have the sub, which is quite a bit louder than our third and second octaves right here. So that might be something to consider looking at. Also, the overall sub is a lot louder than the whole track. So there might need to be some work done here. But before we do that, let's go ahead and bring in a already mastered and mixed track. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up Metric AB, which is a really nifty tool for allowing you to reference your track against the tracks of others who already had their songs mixed and mastered. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up a track from a release that I did quite a while ago, but that has been quite successful as far as the trance and progressive world go. And generally speaking, if you're gonna use a reference track, it's always helpful if it's in the same key as your own track. It's not always necessary, but it will give you an idea of the frequencies that perhaps your track is maybe lacking, and you can kind of see exactly where the kick and bass relationship isn't working out too well. So I'm going to go ahead and use Pro Q3 again because I would like to see what this reference track sounds like. So let me make sure that I have my EQ after Metric AB. And I'm going to put this right around the drop and play it back for a little bit. Cool, so with this information here, I can kind of see that the way my track, the curves and all that kind of stuff aren't really too far off from where we have our track. I think the current track we have is, in other words, the one that we're trying to master has a little bit more bass. And actually, I'm going to show you a cool trick that you can do. You can load in the mastered track, okay? And what we're going to do is we're actually going to insert one Pro Q3 on the original track and then one on the reference track. So let's go ahead and do that. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to come here and then give each track its name. So this one's going to be called Before Tonight because that's the name of the reference track. And this one is just going to be called Original. So now I'm able to see both of these in context. So if I were to play this track, actually I'm going to use this one, and I wanted to bring up the reference track, I can see them side by side in the EQ. So watch this. So by using this tool, I can in real time see two different tracks, what they're doing, and being able to put them side by side, and being able to just really analyze them and see if there is anything that's off about them. And so, yeah, this is just a really nice little tool that you can use to analyze your tracks. So let's go ahead and do that a little bit and see if we can come up with any inconsistencies between the two tracks. Let me actually turn this off. So just to be clear, that one in the background in the red is the reference track, and the one that I currently have open that is doing this curvature right here is my original track. Cool, so one of the first things you can tell right here in this section, this reference track has a slight more of an octave, but that could be because of the key that it's in, right? And it looks like it's kind of peaking a little bit higher at around 40. But the main thing I wanted to make sure was that my mid-range was good, which looks like, it looks like it's actually really consistent with that. The highs all look good. So, I mean, overall, this track is pretty well, it's in a pretty good position to be mastered, right? So, I mean, I have a mastered track where I can listen to and kind of get an idea of whether or not it's close to my reference, and it is close to my reference. So let's go ahead and move on to the next stage. And by the way, EQ matching can be done with a variety of different plugins. In this case, I'm not really EQ matching as much as I am just sort of trying to get an idea of whether or not my two tracks are similar in terms of the overall vibe. There's tons of different tools that you can use to be able to gauge the different comparisons between your track and another track. Even Metric AB has a spectrum analyzer that will let you kind of see both of your tracks together, like here. I personally am not a huge fan of the spectrums in Metric AB, but they can be helpful to identify quick problems, and one of the things that I really like about it is being able to solo out certain frequencies. So let's say, for instance, I want to listen to the sub on my reference track, or even my bass. I'd be able to compare them, which is super helpful when you're having mix issues and you're not really sure whether or not they're sounding anywhere close to each other. All right, so let's move on and let's get into some compression. For compression, I typically leave that up to the mastering engineer, but if you're trying to compress your own track to give it some sort of identity, the first thing you want to make sure of is that your signal is coming in not too hot, right? You want to be able to have your signal coming in, especially on the loudest part of the song, anywhere between -3 and -6 dB, which is something that we covered in the last video. So let's go ahead and look and check out our spectrum, or I'm sorry, our peak, and let's see where it's at. So right now it's a little loud. It's at -1.42. So let's bring that down by 2 dB. We're just going to go over to the gain knob over here on our mix bus. And actually, I'm going to put this on the actual channel. Maybe raise that up a little bit. And there we have it at -3.4. It's a pretty good spot for where we want it at. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to open Pro C2, or if you want to use the glue compressor, we can use that as well. For Ableton users, this is probably the easiest way. But what we're going to do is we're going to set the attack to 3, and then I'm going to set the release to 0.1. That's just sort of a personal preference of mine. And from here, what we're going to be doing is we're going to bring the threshold down until we get about 2 to 3 dB in gain reduction. So that's right about the mark that we're looking for. We're going to use some makeup gain, get the volume back where it was. As you can hear there, that compressor is adding quite a bit of glueness, intensity. Let's check it out with Pro C2 and see if we can get something similar. With Pro C2, make sure that you're always looking at this middle bar right here to see how much gain reduction you're doing. So I'm going to start off at 0. Right around there, I think, is a pretty good spot. So let's get this attack up to about about 1 millisecond. And then for the release, or actually no, let's bring up the attack to 3. Yeah, there we go. And then let's bring the release down. And again, we're kind of doing the similar setup that we had over here. In this case, the Pro C2 sounds a little cleaner to my ears. It doesn't sound as heavy and compressed. Let's try what it sounds like with the mastering setting on. Whenever you're using compressors and you're doing gain reduction, you want to try to get to the level that it was matched at before the compressor was inserted on there. So, if your compressor, or if your song before your compressor, was hitting like 3 dB, you bring your compressor down and then it goes down minus 3 dB. You want to try to get that auto gain manually, and so it's not auto, but you want to try to bring up that gain so that you can get that nice same level, and so that way you can compare how your compressor sounded before and after, and not just think that it sounds loud and good. I'm going to bring the threshold down just a little bit because we're hitting -5, and I kind of want to just only get like -2, -3. Yeah, right around there. So, the mastering style and the bus style both sound really nice to me. But it's it's really up to you. It's a personal choice that's in that case where you want to take it. I like the bus one. It just sounds a little more transparent and clean. So yeah, that's how we do the mastering section, compression section of our master bus. I'm going to bring this utility tool back over here. And let's just go ahead and play it back with our reference, which we have here. I'm just going to loop this section right here so that we can play them back to back. One thing too that I want to point out is a lot of times reference tracks are extremely loud, right? Because they're mastered. And so, while you're mastering, one of the things you can do is do a loudness match with metric AB. So if you click on this button right here, it's going to play back the loudness of the reference track and your track, and then try to get them even so that you're not having to worry about loudness quite yet. Great. So now that we have those two components together nicely leveled, we can move on to the next stage of our mastering video, which is going to be in part 3. So don't miss that one.